The morning Willa Jenkins turned 18, her father looked up from his coffee with those cold gray eyes and said, "Another year older and still worthless as a three-legged mule." And she felt something inside her chest crack like dried leather, left too long in the Texas sun. It was 1882 in Dalhart, Texas, a dusty trading post town where the railroad had brought equal parts prosperity and trouble, and Willa had spent every one of those 18 years trying to become someone her father might love. The ranch house sat on 200 acres of stubborn land that fought every seed planted in its soil, and Harold Jenkins blamed his daughter for every failed crop, every dried up well, every misfortune that had befallen him since his wife died, giving birth to the girl. Willa's mother had been gone so long that the only proof she ever existed was a faded daguerreotype in a silver frame that Harold kept turned face down on the mantel. Willa swallowed the hurt the way she always did, let it settle somewhere deep in her stomach, where it could join all the other cruel words her father had spoken over the years. She finished her breakfast in silence while Harold read the week-old newspaper from Amarillo, his jaw working mechanically on the biscuits she had made before dawn. The kitchen was spotless because it had to be. Any speck of dust or unwashed dish would earn her another lecture about her uselessness, her burden on his life, how he could have remarried and had sons if he had not been saddled with a girl who could not even keep house properly. After breakfast, Willa went out to tend the chickens and feed the two remaining horses they kept, both aging mares that had seen better days. The morning heat was already climbing, promising another scorcher of a day. The panhandle stretched out endlessly in all directions, flat and unforgiving, and sometimes Willa stood at the fence line and wondered what lay beyond the horizon. She had never been more than 10 miles from this ranch. Her father said there was no reason for her to go anywhere, that she would just embarrass him with her foolishness if she went to town unchaperoned. But today was different. Today, Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch had asked Harold if Willa might come help her with canning for a few days, and surprisingly, he had agreed. Mrs. Patterson was a widow with 5 children and a reputation for generosity that made even Harold Jenkins reluctant to refuse her requests. So for the first time in over a year, Willa would get to leave the ranch, even if only to go 3 miles down the road. She packed a small bag with her 2 spare dresses and the book she had read so many times the pages were falling out. Harold drove her over in the wagon without saying a word, dropped her at the Patterson gate, and left without a goodbye. Mrs. Patterson came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her round face creased with smile lines that deepened when she saw Willa. "There you are, dear girl," Mrs. Patterson said, pulling Willa into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and soap. "Come inside out of this heat. We have got 3 bushels of tomatoes to get through today, and my girls are already working on the beans." The Patterson house was full of noise and life, children running through the rooms, a baby crying somewhere upstairs, and the kitchen bustling with activity. Willa had forgotten what it felt like to be in a home where people spoke to each other with kindness, where laughter came easily. Mrs. Patterson's daughters ranged from 7 to 16, and they welcomed Willa like she was a sister they had been missing. They worked through the afternoon, talking and singing while they prepared the vegetables, and when dinner time came, everyone sat together at a long table and passed dishes back and forth while sharing stories about their day. Willa felt tears prick her eyes when Mrs. Patterson asked her opinion on something, actually waited to hear her answer, and nodded thoughtfully at her response. This was what family could be like. This was what she had been missing all these years. That evening, after the children were in bed, Mrs. Patterson sat with Willa on the front porch and poured them each a cup of chamomile tea. The stars were coming out, bright and countless in the vast Texas sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the night. "Willa," Mrs. Patterson said gently, "I want you to know that you are welcome here anytime. If things ever become too difficult at home, you have a place with us." Willa looked down at her tea, her throat tight. "Thank you, madam. That means more than you know." "Your father is a hard man," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Grief did something terrible to him when your mother passed. But his pain does not give him the right to hurt you, child. Nobody had ever said anything like that to Willa before. She had always assumed that her father was right, that she truly was worthless, that his anger was justified. Hearing someone suggest otherwise made something shift inside her, like a door opening in a house she thought had no exits. The next morning, Willa was up early helping Mrs. Patterson prepare breakfast when they heard horses approaching. Through the window, Willa saw three riders coming up the road, cowboys by the look of them, and one of them sat his horse with the kind of easy confidence that made her pause in her work. Mrs. Patterson smiled and went to the door. That will be the Williams brothers. They work the cattle on the north section of our land. Come in, boys. Breakfast is nearly ready. The three men filed into the kitchen, removing their hats and greeting Mrs. Patterson with respectful nods. Two of them were clearly brothers, both with dark hair and similar features, but the third man caught Willa's attention immediately. He was tall and lean, with sandy hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of summer sky. When he saw Willa, he stopped mid-step and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something neither of them could name yet. This is Willa Jenkins from the neighboring ranch, Mrs. Patterson said. She's helping me with the canning this week. Willa, these are the Williams brothers, Thomas and Timothy, and their cousin Tate Walker. Tate Walker. The name fitted him somehow. He stepped forward and offered his hand, and when Willa took it, she felt a warmth spread through her palm that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Pleased to meet you, Miss Jenkins, Tate said, and his voice was deep and gentle, nothing like the harsh tones she was used to hearing. They all sat down to breakfast, and Willa found herself seated across from Tate. She tried to focus on her food, but she kept noticing things about him. The way he thanked Mrs. Patterson for every dish she passed, how he listened when his cousins talked, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work. Once she looked up and found him watching her, and instead of looking away, he smiled. After breakfast, the men went back to their work, and Willa returned to the canning with a strange lightness in her chest that she could not explain. Mrs. Patterson caught her gazing out the window toward the north pasture more than once and said nothing, but her eyes twinkled with knowing amusement. That evening, when the work was done and the day was cooling into twilight, Willa walked out to the well to draw water for the morning. She was struggling with the heavy bucket when she heard footsteps behind her. "Let me help you with that, miss," Tate Walker said, appearing beside her and taking the rope from her hands. He hauled the bucket up with ease and set it on the stone rim of the well. "Thank you," Willa said, suddenly shy. "You did not have to do that." "I know," Tate said, "but I wanted to." He paused, then added, "Mrs. Patterson says you are staying through the week." "Yes, we have a lot of canning to finish." "That is good." He smiled again, and Willa felt that warmth spreading through her chest. "I was hoping I might see you again." They stood there in the gathering darkness, and Willa felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. Nobody had ever looked at her the way Tate Walker was looking at her now, like she was something precious instead of burdensome. "I should get back inside," Willa said finally, though she did not want to leave. "Of course." Tate picked up the water bucket. "Let me carry this in for you." They walked back to the house together, and when they reached the porch, Tate set down the bucket and turned to her. "Miss Jenkins, would it be all right if I came by tomorrow evening? Maybe we could take a walk, if Mrs. Patterson does not mind." Willa's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I would like that very much, Mr. Walker." "Tate," he said. "Please, just call me Tate." "Then you should call me Willa." He smiled, touched the brim of his hat, and walked back toward the bunkhouse where the ranch hands stayed. Willa stood on the porch for a long moment, watching him go, and feeling like her whole life had just tilted on its axis. The next day seemed to last forever. Willa worked through the canning with Mrs. Patterson and her daughters, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. Mrs. Patterson noticed, of course, and finally put down her stirring spoon and looked at Willa with gentle eyes. Tate Walker is a good man, she said quietly, so the children would not hear. He has worked for us for 2 years now. Ever since his parents passed from fever, he is honest and kind and hardworking. His cousins are fine men too, but Tate has always been something special. I barely know him, Willa protested, but her cheeks were burning. Sometimes knowing happens faster than we expect, Mrs. Patterson said. I knew my husband for 3 days before I knew I would marry him. We had 30 good years together before the consumption took him. Do not be afraid of your own heart, child. When evening finally came, Willa changed into her better dress, the blue calico one that she had made herself last winter. She brushed her dark hair until it shone and pinned it up carefully. In the small mirror in the bedroom, she studied her reflection, trying to see what Tate Walker might see. She had never thought of herself as pretty. Her father had told her often enough that she was plain, that her brown eyes were too wide and her mouth too large. But maybe her father had been wrong about that too. Maybe she was not worthless or plain or any of the things he had said. Tate arrived just as the sun was setting, turning the sky into ribbons of gold and orange and deep purple. He had changed into a clean shirt and combed his hair back, and when he saw Willa, his face lit up in a way that made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. They walked out past the barn and along the fence line, where the evening air was cooler and filled with the sounds of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. For a while they did not speak, just walked side by side, occasionally glancing at each other, and then away. Finally, Tate said, "Tell me about yourself, Willa. What do you like to do when you are not canning vegetables?" Willa laughed, surprised by the question. Nobody had ever asked her that before. I like to read, she said, though I only have a few books, and I like to watch the birds. We get all kinds on the ranch, meadowlarks and hawks and roadrunners. Sometimes I try to sketch them, though I am not very good at it. I bet you are better than you think, Tate said. What do you read? Anything I can get my hands on. Right now, I am reading David Copperfield for the 3rd time because it is the only book I have that my father has not thrown into the fire. Tate stopped walking and turned to look at her. He burns your books? Willa immediately regretted saying anything. Only when he thinks I am wasting time that should be spent working. It is all right. No, Tate said firmly. It is not all right. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, Is he cruel to you, Willa? Your father? She wanted to lie, to protect herself with the same walls she had built over the years. But something about the concern in Tate's eyes made her tell the truth. He tells me I am worthless. Every morning he finds a new way to say it, that I am useless, that I ruined his life, that everything wrong in his world is my fault. Tate's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed gentle. He is wrong. You know that, do not you? He is completely wrong. Tears burned in Willa's eyes, and she looked away, not wanting Tate to see her cry. But he stepped closer and gently touched her chin, turning her face back toward his. You are not worthless, Willa Jenkins, he said, his voice low and fierce. You are precious. Anyone with eyes can see that. The word hit her like a physical thing. Precious. Nobody had ever called her that. She had never imagined anyone would. A tear slipped down her cheek, and Tate caught it with his thumb, his touch impossibly gentle. They stood there in the dying light, and Willa felt something breaking open inside her, all the years of hurt and loneliness, and believing she was not worthy of love. And in the ruins of those old beliefs, something new was growing, something green and hopeful and terrifying. I should not be talking to you like this, Tate said, his hand still cradling her face. We just met, but I cannot help it. From the moment I saw you, I felt like I had been looking for you my whole life without knowing it. I feel it too, Willa whispered. And it scares me. It scares me as well, Tate admitted. But I think some things are worth being scared for. They walked back to the house slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. At the porch, Tate took both of her hands in his and looked at her seriously. "Can I see you again tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," Willa said, "please." "Then I will be here." He squeezed her hands gently and then released them, stepping back reluctantly. "Good night, Willa." "Good night, Tate." She watched him walk away into the darkness, and when she finally went inside, Mrs. Patterson was waiting with a knowing smile and 2 cups of tea. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, and Willa told her everything, all the feelings tumbling out in a rush of words. Mrs. Patterson listened and nodded and finally said, "Love is a gift, child. When it comes, do not turn it away out of fear. You deserve every happiness this world can offer." The week at the Patterson ranch passed in a blur of work and wonder. Every evening, Tate came to walk with Willa, and every evening they grew closer. He told her about growing up on a ranch in New Mexico, about losing his parents when he was 16, about coming to Texas with his cousins to start fresh. He talked about his dreams of having his own land someday, a place where he could raise cattle and horses and build a home. Willa told him things she had never told anyone about her mother's death, about growing up with a father who saw her as a reminder of everything he had lost, about the loneliness that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. Tate listened to every word, his attention never wavering, and he never once made her feel like her pain was too much or her fears were foolish. On the fourth evening, they sat together on a fallen log near the creek that ran through the Patterson property. The water moved slowly, catching the last light of day, and somewhere nearby, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire of borrowed songs. "I am dreading going back home," Willa admitted. "I know it is only 3 miles, but it feels like going back to prison." Tate was quiet for a moment, then said, "What if you did not have to go back?" Willa looked at him, her heart suddenly racing. "What do you mean?" "Marry me, Willa." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and perfect. Willa stared at him. Sure, she must have misheard. "We have known each other less than a week," she said finally. "I know." Tate took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "And if you need more time, I will wait. I will court you properly for a year, if that is what you need. But I already know what my heart is telling me. I love you, Willa. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel worthless again." "My father would never give permission," Willa said, but hope was rising in her chest like a bird taking flight. "You are 18 now. You do not need his permission. We could go to town tomorrow, get the license, have the preacher marry us. Mrs. Patterson would stand witness, I am sure of it." "What about your work? Where would we live?" "I have money saved," Tate said. "Enough to rent a place in town for a while. And I have been talking with the owner of the Fletcher Ranch about managing his cattle operation. It pays well, and it comes with a house, a small one, but it would be ours. I was going to wait another year before applying, but if you say yes, I will apply tomorrow." Willa's mind was spinning. Everything was happening so fast. But when she looked at Tate, at the hope and love shining in his blue eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that this was right. This was the life she was meant to have. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Tate's face broke into the most beautiful smile she had ever seen. He pulled her close and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise, and Willa felt like she was finally coming home. They told Mrs. Patterson that night, and she cried happy tears and hugged them both and immediately started planning. The next morning, she drove them into Dalhart in her wagon, with her oldest daughter along to watch the store while Mrs. Patterson helped with the arrangements. They went to the courthouse for the license, then to the little white church on Main Street, where Reverend Thompson agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon. Willa stood in the back room of the church in her blue calico dress, while Mrs. Patterson pinned flowers in her hair, wildflowers that the children had picked that morning. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. This was joy, pure and overwhelming. "Are you sure about this, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "There is no shame in taking more time if you need it." "I am sure," Willa said. "For the first time in my life, I am completely sure about something." The ceremony was simple and short. Thomas and Timothy Williams stood as witnesses, along with Mrs. Patterson and her daughter. Tate stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, his eyes never leaving Willa's face as she walked down the short aisle. When Reverend Thompson asked if he would take Willa as his wife, Tate's voice rang out clear and strong. "I will." And when it was Willa's turn, she said the words with equal conviction, feeling chains breaking away from her heart with every syllable. They signed the papers, and just like that, Willa Jenkins became Willa Walker. She had a new name and a new life and a husband who looked at her like she hung the moon and stars. There was no money for a wedding trip, but Tate had rented a small room above the general store in town for the night. They had dinner at the boarding house restaurant, and Mrs. Patterson insisted on paying for it as a wedding gift. Then, as the sun set over Dalhart, Tate carried Willa up the stairs to their room, and they began their life together. That night, in the quiet darkness with Tate's arms around her, Willa finally understood what it meant to be cherished. Every touch was gentle, every word tender. Tate took his time, making sure she felt safe and loved, and when she fell asleep hours later, it was with a smile on her face and peace in her heart. The next morning, they had to face the difficult task of going to Harold Jenkins and telling him what Willa had done. Tate wanted to go alone, afraid of what Harold might do or say, but Willa insisted on coming with him. She needed to face her father as a married woman, no longer under his control. They rode out to the ranch in the wagon Tate had borrowed from Mrs. Patterson. As they approached the house, Willa felt her old fears rising up, but then Tate reached over and took her hand, and she remembered that she was not alone anymore. Harold was in the barn when they arrived. He looked up from mucking stalls, his face twisting into a scowl when he saw Willa. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "You are supposed to be at the Patterson place for another 2 days." "Pa," Willa said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I need to tell you something. This is Tate Walker. We got married yesterday." For a moment, Harold just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face went red, and he threw down the pitchfork he was holding. "You did what?" he roared. "You stupid, worthless girl. You think you can just run off and get married without my permission?" "I am 18, Willa said. "I do not need your permission." Harold advanced on her, his fists clenched, but Tate stepped smoothly between them, his stance protective but not aggressive. "That is close enough, sir," Tate said firmly. "Willa is my wife now. I will not let anyone hurt her, including you." "You think you can come onto my property and threaten me?" Harold snarled. "I am not threatening anyone," Tate replied calmly. "But I am making a promise. Willa is under my protection now. If you ever speak to her the way you have been speaking to her, if you ever lay a hand on her, you will answer to me." Harold looked between them, his rage palpable. "Get off my land, both of you! You are no daughter of mine anymore." The words should have hurt, but instead, Willa felt a strange sense of relief. This was the severing she had needed, the final cut that would let her move forward without looking back. "Fine," she said, "but I am taking my things." She went to the house with Tate beside her and gathered the few possessions that mattered to her, her clothes, her books, the daguerreotype of her mother. Harold stood in the doorway, glowering but not interfering, perhaps because Tate's presence made him think twice about his usual cruelty. When they were done, Willa took one last look at the house where she had grown up. There was no fondness in her gaze, no nostalgia for the hard years she had spent within those walls. She was leaving, and she was not coming back. They loaded her things into the wagon and drove away. Willa did not look back. Mrs. Patterson had offered to let them stay with her until Tate heard about the ranch manager job, but that very afternoon, a rider came with news. The owner of the Fletcher Ranch wanted to meet with Tate as soon as possible. Apparently, Mrs. Patterson had sent word ahead, giving Tate a glowing recommendation, and combined with the reputation he had built over the past 2 years, it was enough to get him serious consideration. Tate rode out to the Fletcher Ranch, which was about 15 miles northwest of Dalhart, and came back that evening with a job offer. The pay was good, and the house, when he showed it to Willa the next day, was small but solid, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a view of rolling grassland that made Willa's heart sing. They moved in a week later, with help from Thomas and Timothy Williams and half the Patterson family. Mrs. Patterson brought housewarming gifts, quilts and dishes, and a rocking chair that had belonged to her grandmother. The older woman hugged Willa tight before she left and whispered, "You are going to be so happy, child. I can feel it." And she was right. Life at the Fletcher Ranch was everything Willa had dreamed of and more. Tate worked long hours managing the cattle operation, but he always came home with a smile on his face and time for his wife. Every evening, no matter how tired he was, he took Willa in his arms and told her he loved her, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Willa threw herself into making their house a home. She planted a garden, learning as she went, and was thrilled when the seeds actually sprouted in the rich soil. She sewed curtains for the windows and taught herself to make bread that did not come out like rocks. She took care of the chickens Tate bought for her and learned to preserve food for the winter. Everything she did with joy, because she was doing it for their life together, not for a man who hated her. At night, lying in bed with Tate's arms around her, Willa would sometimes cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being loved. Tate would hold her and stroke her hair and whisper, "You are precious to me, Willa Walker. You always will be." The first time she said those words to him, "You are precious to me too," Tate kissed her so tenderly that she felt it in her bones. Months passed, turning into seasons. Willa learned to ride properly, and Tate bought her a gentle mare named Daisy so they could ride together in the evenings. They explored the ranch land, discovering hidden creeks and watching sunsets that painted the whole sky in shades of fire and gold. Tate taught Willa to rope and to identify different cattle breeds, and she taught him the names of all the birds she had been watching for years. They made friends with the other ranch families, attended church socials and barn dances, and slowly built a community around them. Willa had never had friends her own age before, and she treasured the relationships she was forming with the other ranch wives. They taught her recipes and quilting patterns and all the small domestic skills she had never properly learned because her father had never cared enough to make sure she knew them. About 6 months into their marriage, Willa realized she had not had her monthly courses in a while. She waited another week to be sure, then told Tate one evening after dinner, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. Tate stared at her for a moment, then let out a whoop of joy and spun her around in his arms. "We are going to have a baby?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "Yes," Willa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to be parents." That night, Tate placed his hand on her still flat belly and made promises to their unborn child that he would always be there, always provide, always love. And watching him, Willa knew that he meant every word. Their child would grow up knowing what she had never known, a father's love. The pregnancy was not easy. Willa was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep anything down, and Tate worried over her constantly. He brought her crackers in bed and held her hair when she was ill, and never once complained about the extra work he had to do because she was too exhausted to keep up with all the household chores. "You are growing our baby," he would say whenever she apologized. "That is the most important work there is." As Willa's belly grew, so did Tate's protectiveness. He did not want her lifting anything heavy or working too hard in the garden. He built her a more comfortable chair and insisted she rest more. The ranch hands teased him about being an overprotective husband, but he did not care. Willa was his whole world, and now the baby she carried was too. One Sunday they were coming out of church when Willa saw her father across the street. Harold Jenkins looked older, more stooped, and when he saw Willa with her rounded belly and Tate's arm around her, Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or just recognition of what he had lost. Willa met his gaze steadily, and after a moment, Harold looked away and walked off alone. She felt Tate's arm tighten around her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Willa said, and realized it was true. She felt no anger toward her father, no lingering hurt. He was just a sad, broken man who had let his grief poison him. She had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. She would not carry his bitterness into her new life. The baby came in early spring of 1883, after a long and difficult labor that left Tate pale and shaken. He had stayed with Willa the whole time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths while the midwife worked. When the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry, Tate actually had tears running down his face. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Willa's chest. "A big, healthy boy." Willa looked down at her son, at his red face and tiny fists, and felt her heart expand so much she thought it might burst. He was perfect. He was theirs. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Thomas Harold Walker, though they called him Tommy from the start. The middle name was Tate's idea, a gesture of reconciliation toward Willa's father, even though Harold had never shown any interest in meeting his grandson. Willa loved her husband even more for the generous spirit that made him offer that olive branch. Tommy was a happy baby, quick to smile and curious about everything. Tate was besotted with him from the first moment, and Willa often found them together in the rocking chair, Tate telling Tommy elaborate stories while the baby cooed and grabbed at his father's fingers. "You are going to spoil him," Willa said one evening, watching them together. "Good," Tate replied, not taking his eyes off his son. "Every child should be spoiled by their parents' love. That is how they learn what love is." Willa thought about her own childhood, about the absence of love and warmth, and knew that Tommy would never doubt for a moment that he was wanted and cherished. The cycle was broken. They were giving their son something completely different than what either of them had received. Life settled into a new rhythm built around the baby's needs. Willa learned to function on less sleep, to nurse while half dozing, to interpret every different cry. Tate helped whenever he could, changing diapers and walking Tommy when he was fussy and taking him on gentle rides around the ranch once he was old enough to sit in the saddle in front of his father. The ranch prospered under Tate's management. The owner, Mr. Fletcher, was impressed with the improvements Tate had made and the way the cattle herd had grown. He gave Tate more responsibility and a raise in pay and started talking about making Tate a partner in the operation. When Tommy was about a year old, Mrs. Patterson came to visit with news. Harold Jenkins had died in his sleep. His heart, the doctor said, just gave out. There would be a funeral in a few days, and the ranch would likely be sold to pay his debts. Willa felt a complicated mix of emotions: sadness for the relationship they had never had, relief that his suffering was over, and a strange sense of peace. She attended the funeral with Tate and Tommy, and was surprised to see how few people were there. Her father had lived a lonely life, pushing away everyone who might have cared for him. At the graveside, Willa said a quiet prayer for his troubled soul, and then walked away, leaving the past buried where it belonged. She had a future to build, a family that needed her, a husband who loved her, and a son who was growing bigger every day. The years that followed were good ones. Tommy grew into a bright, energetic toddler who kept his parents running. When he was 3, Willa discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. She gave birth to a daughter they named Violet, a tiny thing with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. Tate held his daughter with the same wonder he had shown with Tommy, and Willa watched him whisper to Violet all the same promises he had made to their son. "You are precious," he told her. "You are loved. You always will be." And hearing those words, the words he had first said to Willa all those years ago, she felt the circle complete itself. The worthless girl her father had seen was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her value, who was raising children, who would never doubt theirs. When Violet was 6 months old, Mr. Fletcher offered to sell Tate a stake in the ranch. The old man was getting on in years and wanted to ensure the property would be in good hands when he was gone. Tate accepted eagerly, and suddenly they were not just ranch employees, but partial owners with a real stake in the land they had been working. They celebrated that night after the children were asleep, dancing around the kitchen to music only they could hear. Tate held Willa close and said, "Do you remember what I told you the night I asked you to marry me? That I wanted my own land someday?" "I remember," Willa said. "This is even better than I imagined," Tate said, "because I am sharing it with you." They added on to the house over the next few years, building more bedrooms and a proper dining room. The garden grew larger and more productive, and Willa started selling her vegetables and preserves in town, bringing in extra income that they saved carefully. Tommy started school in Dalhart, riding into town each morning with Tate and coming home full of stories about what he had learned. Violet grew into a spirited little girl who followed her brother everywhere and demanded to learn everything he was learning. When Tommy was 8 and Violet was 5, Willa gave birth to their third child, another son they named Samuel. By then, the routine of parenthood was familiar, and they navigated the sleepless nights and endless needs with practiced ease. Tommy was old enough to be a real helper, fetching diapers and entertaining Violet while Willa nursed the baby. Violet was entranced by her new brother and wanted to hold him constantly, her small face serious with the responsibility. The Fletcher Ranch continued to thrive, and when Mr. Fletcher passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, he left his remaining share of the ranch to Tate and Willa in his will. They were stunned by the generosity and deeply saddened by the loss of the old man who had become like a father to Tate and a grandfather to their children. But they honored his memory by running the ranch the way he would have wanted, with integrity and care for both the land and the animals. They hired good hands and paid them fair wages. They invested in better breeding stock and modern equipment. And slowly, the Walker Ranch became known throughout the Texas Panhandle as a place where good work was rewarded and people were treated with respect. The children grew older, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Tommy loved the ranch work and announced at age 10 that he wanted to be a rancher like his father. Violet was more interested in books and learning and talked about becoming a teacher. Samuel was still young, but he showed signs of being the most adventurous of the three, always climbing trees and exploring places he should not go. Willa and Tate grew older too, their love deepening with every passing year. They had their disagreements, of course what married couple did not, but they had learned early on how to talk through their problems, how to listen to each other, how to compromise, and they never, ever went to bed angry. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tate took Willa on a trip, leaving the children with Mrs. Patterson for a week. They rode to Amarillo and stayed in a real hotel and ate in restaurants and went to a theater performance. It was a different world from their daily life on the ranch, and they enjoyed every moment, but they were also happy to come home to their children and their land and their life. "I never thought I could be this happy," Willa said one night, lying in their bed with Tate's arms around her. "When I was 18, I thought my life was going to be lonely and hard forever. And then you came along and changed everything." "You changed everything for me too," Tate said, kissing her temple. "I was just going through the motions before I met you. You gave me a purpose, a family, a home. You are still the most precious thing in my world, Willa Walker." There it was again, that word, precious. Tate had never stopped using it, never let her forget that she was valuable and loved. And Willa had blossomed under that constant affirmation, growing into a confident, capable woman who ran their household and helped manage the ranch and raise their children with wisdom and love. She thought sometimes about that 18-year-old girl who had stood in her father's kitchen and absorbed his cruel words like they were gospel truth. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what was coming, that in just a few days she would meet a sandy-haired cowboy with sky-blue eyes who would show her what real love looked like, that she would have a husband who cherished her and children who adored her and a life filled with purpose and joy. But maybe that girl had needed to go through all that pain to appreciate the happiness that came after. Maybe the contrast was what made their love story so sweet, because Willa knew, with every fiber of her being, how rare and precious it was to be truly loved. The years continued to pass in a parade of seasons and celebrations. Tommy grew tall and strong, working alongside his father from dawn to dusk and learning everything there was to know about running a ranch. Violet did become a teacher, attending the normal school in Amarillo and returning to teach at the Dahlhart School. Samuel developed a talent for breaking horses, gentling even the wildest mustangs with patience and kindness. And through it all, Willa and Tate remained each other's constant. They still took evening walks when they could, still held hands like young lovers, still found reasons to smile at each other across crowded rooms. Their friends marveled at how they never seemed to tire of each other's company, how they still looked at each other with the same warmth and affection they had shown as newlyweds. "What is your secret?" one of the ranch wives asked Willa at a church social when they had been married for 15 years. Willa thought about it carefully. "I think," she said finally, "it is because we both know what it is like to not be loved. Tate lost his parents young, and my father never showed me kindness. So when we found each other, we recognized how precious love is. We never take it for granted. We choose each other every single day." When Tommy was 20, he married a sweet girl named Elizabeth from one of the neighboring ranches, and they built a house on the Walker property so Tommy could continue working the cattle. A year later, they had a baby girl, and Willa became a grandmother, which made her laugh because she felt far too young for that title. But holding her granddaughter, feeling the weight of the next generation in her arms, Willa understood that this was the ultimate proof that she had broken the cycle. This baby girl would grow up in a family where love was spoken freely, where children were treasured, where harsh words and cruelty had no place. The poisonous legacy of Harold Jenkins ended with Willa. Everything that came after was light and love and hope. Violet married a few years later, a banker from Amarillo who adored her intelligence and spirit. Samuel met a rancher's daughter at a horse fair and courted her for 2 years before finally convincing her to marry him. All 3 children were happy, settled, building lives that reflected the values they had learned from their parents. And through every milestone, every celebration, Tate was by Willa's side. His hair went silver at the temples, and lines formed around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to Willa, he was still the handsome cowboy who had looked at her across Mrs. Patterson's breakfast table and made her believe in possibilities. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends, and Reverend Thompson, now old and bent, but still serving the Dahlhart Church, said a blessing over their continued union. Tate stood up to make a toast, and his voice was thick with emotion. "25 years ago," he said, "I met a girl who had been told her whole life that she was worthless, and I knew, from the first moment I saw her, that she was the most precious person I would ever meet. Marrying her was the best decision I ever made. Every day with her has been a gift." He turned to Willa, tears shining in his blue eyes. "Thank you for choosing me, Willa. Thank you for building this life with me. I love you more today than I did that first day, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Willa could not speak through her tears, but she did not need to. She stood and kissed her husband while their family and friends cheered, and in that moment, she felt the full weight of her happiness. She had survived her father's cruelty. She had found love against all odds. She had built a family and a legacy that would last long after she was gone. That night, lying in bed in the house they had shared for so many years, Tate held Willa close and said, as he had said thousands of times before, "You are precious to me." And Willa, as she had said thousands of times in return, whispered back, "You are precious to me too." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms. two people who had found each other in a harsh and unforgiving world and had chosen to create something beautiful together. The morning would come, as it always did, with work to be done and responsibilities to meet. But for now, in the darkness and quiet, there was only love constant, enduring, and more precious than gold. As the years advanced and they grew older still, Willa and Tate settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. Their bodies slowed, their joints ached on cold mornings, but their love never diminished. They handed more of the ranch responsibilities over to Tommy and his family, though Tate still went out to check the herds most mornings, and Willa still tended her now famous garden. Grandchildren multiplied, filling their lives with laughter and chaos. The house was never quiet on Sundays, when all the children and grandchildren came for dinner. Willa would cook enormous meals with help from her daughters and daughters-in-law, and Tate would sit in his chair by the fireplace with a grandchild on each knee, telling them stories about the old days. Sometimes, when it was just the two of them, they would sit on the porch as the sun set and remember. Remember that first week at Mrs. Patterson's place, when they had fallen in love so quickly it seemed like magic. Remember the wedding in the little white church. Remember bringing each baby home and the terror and joy of parenthood. Remember every triumph and every struggle and every quiet moment in between. Do you ever regret it? Willa asked one evening, watching the sky turn purple and orange. Marrying me so quickly, we barely knew each other. Tate took her hand, his fingers threading through hers the way they had 1,000 times before. Not for one single second, he said firmly. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Willa Walker. I knew it then, and I know it now. I knew it too, Willa admitted. Even though I was scared, even though I had never been loved before and did not know what it was supposed to feel like. Something in me recognized you, recognized that you were my home. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the day end. In the distance, they could hear the cattle lowing and the evening birds beginning their songs. This land, this life, this love, it was everything Willa had never dared to dream of when she was that broken girl in her father's house. When Mrs. Patterson passed away at the age of 82, Willa and Tate were at her bedside. The old woman who had been instrumental in bringing them together, who had offered Willa kindness when she needed it most, died peacefully with her children and grandchildren and chosen family around her. At the funeral, Willa spoke about how Mrs. Patterson had changed her life, had shown her that family could be more than blood, that kindness mattered. She saved me, Willa said simply. And in saving me, she gave me the chance to build all of this. Every happiness I have had can be traced back to the week I spent in her kitchen, canning tomatoes and learning what love looked like. As they entered their 30s year of marriage, Willa and Tate began to think about their legacy, about what they would leave behind when they were gone. The ranch would go to Tommy. That was certain. He had earned it through years of hard work and dedication. But they wanted to do something more, something that would help other young people who found themselves in situations like Willa had been in. They established a fund at the church specifically to help young women who needed to escape difficult home situations. It paid for room and board, for training and useful skills, for hope and a fresh start. They did not advertise their role in creating the fund, but word got around anyway, and Willa received more than one tearful thank you from girls who reminded her so much of her younger self. This is what it is all about, Tate said one evening after they had met with yet another girl who needed help. Using what we have been given to make things better for others, that is the real meaning of blessing, not hoarding it, but passing it on. Willa squeezed his hand, loving him even more for his generous heart. They had been shaped by pain, both of them, but instead of letting it make them bitter, they had chosen to let it make them kind. That was the real victory, she thought. Not just surviving, but becoming people who made survival possible for others. Their 40th anniversary came on a cool October day, and their family threw them a celebration that seemed to include half of Dalhart. The church hall was packed with friends and neighbors, all there to honor the couple who had become pillars of the community. Stories were told, toasts were made, and through it all, Willa and Tate sat hand in hand, marveling at the life they had built. Reverend Thompson's son, who had taken over the church after his father retired, gave a short speech about love and commitment. In a world where so many things are temporary, he said, Willa and Tate Walker have shown us what it means to build something lasting. They have weathered storms and celebrated joys, always together, always choosing each other. They are an example to all of us of what marriage should be. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Tate pulled Willa onto the dance floor one more time. The musicians played a slow waltz, and they moved together with the ease of decades of practice, their bodies knowing exactly how to fit together. 40 years, Tate said, his cheek pressed against Willa's hair, and it still does not feel like enough time with you. We will have more, Willa promised. We are not done yet. And they were not. They had several more good years, years of watching grandchildren graduate and get married, of welcoming great-grandchildren into the world, of running the ranch and tending the garden, and loving each other with the same fierce devotion they had always shared. When Tate finally passed away at the age of 72, after a brief illness that took him quickly, Willa was holding his hand. His last words to her were the ones he had spoken so many times over their life together. You are precious to me. And Willa, through her tears, whispered back, You are precious to me too. Always. She mourned him deeply, as a woman mourns the loss of her other half. But she did not despair because she knew how lucky she had been. Some people went their whole lives without experiencing the kind of love she and Tate had shared. She had 47 years of being cherished, of being seen and valued and loved. That was more than most people ever got. Willa lived for another 8 years after Tate's death, and she spent them surrounded by family, passing on the stories and the values that she and Tate had built their life on. She told her grandchildren about their grandfather, about how he had saved her from a life of misery, about how he had called her precious every single day and meant it. When her time finally came, Willa was ready. She died peacefully in her sleep, and her children found her with a smile on her face, as if she had seen something beautiful in her final moments. They buried her next to Tate on a hill overlooking the ranch, and on her gravestone they carved the words that had defined her life. She was precious, and she was loved. The story could have ended there, but love stories never really end. They ripple outward, touching lives for generations. The Walker Ranch continued to thrive under Tommy's management and then his sons after him. The fund that Willa and Tate had established helped hundreds of young women over the years, giving them the same chance at a new life that Willa had been given. And every time a Walker child or grandchild or great-grandchild fell in love, they remembered the story of Willa and Tate, how they had found each other against all odds, how they had built something beautiful out of pain and hope, how they had loved each other with unwavering devotion until death parted them. It became a family legend, the kind of love story that set the standard for all the generations that followed, because that was the true ending of Willa Jenkins, who became Willa Walker not in her death, but in the legacy of love she left behind. She had been told she was worthless, but she had proven that wrong in every possible way. She had created value wherever she went, in the children she raised, the family she built, the lives she touched, and the love she shared. Her father had been wrong about her, completely, utterly wrong. And somewhere, Willa liked to think, he finally understood that. She hoped he had found peace in whatever came after death, that he had been reunited with the wife he had lost, and that they had both forgiven themselves for the pain they had caused. But whether Harold Jenkins found redemption or not, Willa's story stood as proof that we are not defined by what others say about us. We are defined by what we choose to do, who we choose to love, and how we choose to move through the world. Willa had chosen kindness and love and hope, and those choices had transformed not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The ranch still stands today, passed down through the generations, and if you visit on a quiet evening, you can almost hear echoes of the past, laughter from the house, the sound of children playing, a man telling his wife she is precious, a woman's grateful reply. The love of Willa and Tate Walker soaked into the very soil of that place, and it grew things not just crops and cattle, but family and hope and the unwavering belief that love, when it is real and true and chosen every day, can heal even the deepest wounds. And that, in the end, is the story of a girl who was called worthless by her father every morning and precious by her cowboy every night. It is a story about the power of love to transform, to heal, to create something beautiful out of broken pieces. It is a story about choosing kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, and love over everything else. It is a story that reminds us that we all deserve to be called precious, to be loved well, to be seen for who we truly are. And it is a story that proves beyond any doubt that the words we speak to each other matter. They can destroy or they can build up. They can wound or they can heal. Willa and Tate chose to build up, to heal, to speak words of life and love to each other and their children and everyone they met. That was their legacy, and it was precious indeed.